I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. The words, muffled by oak and distance, were like stones dropped into the deep, still well of my life. And I knew, with the chilling certainty of the perpetually overlooked, that the ripples would change everything. My cousin Robert's voice was the loudest, laced with the frantic, brittle confidence of a man who has gambled away all but his last, most desperate idea. "Use her to pay the debt! Blackwood is a recluse, a monster for all we know. He will not care who warms his bed, so long as my markers are cleared." A low murmur from my Uncle Thomas, his voice the sound of wet sand, easily shaped and just as easily washed away. Then my Aunt Augusta, sharp and clear as shattered glass. "Robert, your vulgarity is exceeded only by your foolishness. We are not selling the girl. We are negotiating a solution. The Duke of Blackwood holds the deeds to half our remaining lands. He requires a companion for his sister, they say. Eleonora is quiet. She is plain. She will not cause trouble. It is a suitable arrangement for an otherwise unmarriageable girl." I did not move from my place in the shadowed hallway. I stood there, a book held loosely in my hand, my heart a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. An unmarriageable girl. A suitable arrangement. A solution. I was a piece on their board, a pawn to be sacrificed to protect their more valuable pieces. I had lived in their house for 10 years, since the fever took my parents and left me an orphan with a small annuity and a library of books they considered a waste of space. I was a creature of corners and quiet rooms, a shadow that tidied up after dinner and read by the fire until the embers died. They had never truly seen me, and now they had found a use for my invisibility. They were sending me to a monster, to a man whispered about in London drawing rooms as the savage Duke, a man who had buried his young wife a decade ago and had not been seen in society since. They were sending me to his remote estate in the north, Blackwood Manor, a place rumored to be as cold and forbidding as its master. And I, Eleonora Vance, was to be the coin of their realm, the silent payment for my cousin's sins. I pressed my fingers against the cool leather of my book, the only inheritance of true value my father had left me. In that moment, I did not feel fear, not yet. I felt a strange, hollow clarity. My life, which had been a state of passive endurance, was about to become something else entirely. I did not know if it would be better or worse, only that the stillness was over. The journey north was a blur of gray skies and rattling carriage wheels. Aunt Augusta had packed my few belongings herself, her movements brisk and efficient, her face a mask of determined charity. She gave me a new woolen shawl, a practical somber gray that matched the landscape. "You must present yourself with dignity, Eleonora," she had instructed, her voice devoid of warmth. "The Duke is a man of particular tastes. Your quiet nature will be an asset. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not offer opinions. Simply be useful." Her instructions were a litany of self-effacement, a formal codification of the role I had been playing my entire life. I was to be a ghost in a new house, just as I had been a ghost in hers. Blackwood Manor rose from the mist-shrouded moors like a fist of granite. It was not a house, it was a fortress, a bulwark against the world, with dark, watchful windows and towers that clawed at the perpetually overcast sky. The air itself seemed heavier here, scented with damp earth and ancient stone. A severe-looking housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, met me at the door. Her face was a roadmap of disapproval, and she looked me up and down as if I were a piece of furniture delivered to the wrong address. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice the rustle of dry leaves, "His Grace is not expecting you today." A flush of humiliation crept up my neck. Of course he was not. My family's desperation had likely outpaced the speed of the mail coach carrying the letter announcing my arrival. I was a parcel, sent ahead of my own bill of lading. "My apologies," I murmured, my voice small in the cavernous, echoing hall. My uncle arranged my travel. It was then that he appeared. He did not walk down the grand staircase. He materialized from the shadows at its summit, a figure of stark, imposing black against the gray light from a high, arched window. The Duke of Blackwood was taller than I had imagined, with a severe, unyielding posture that spoke of absolute control. His hair was as dark as a raven's wing, and his face was all sharp angles and forbidding lines, a face that looked as if it had been carved from the same granite as his home. But it was his eyes that held me. They were a startling pale gray, the color of a winter sea, and they were utterly devoid of warmth. He descended the stairs with a slow, deliberate grace, his gaze fixed upon me. It was not a glance, not the polite sweep of a host greeting a guest, but a direct, analytical assessment that stripped away all pretense. I felt pinned by it, like a moth under glass. He stopped a few feet from me, the air growing thick and heavy with his presence. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the hall. It was not unkind, but it was profoundly weary, as if the act of speaking required an effort he could barely summon. I curtsied, my movements stiff with nerves. "Your Grace." He looked from me to the single, sad-looking trunk the driver had deposited by the door. "My sister," he said, the words clipped, "passed away 2 years ago. I am afraid your uncle has been misinformed as to the nature of my household." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. No sister. The entire premise of my presence here was a lie, a flimsy fabrication my aunt had concocted to give this sordid transaction a veneer of respectability. I was not a companion. I was simply the debt. The truth of it stood naked and ugly in the cold hall between us. I felt a hot surge of shame, so powerful it threatened to choke me. I lifted my chin, the only act of defiance I could muster. "Then it seems I have been sent here under false pretenses, Your Grace. I can only offer my sincerest apologies for the intrusion. I will arrange for return passage at once." It was then that it happened. As I spoke, my voice trembling only slightly, his expression shifted. The cool, dismissive assessment in his eyes flickered, replaced by something else. It was a look of sharp, unexpected focus, a sudden and unnerving attention. He was not looking at the poor relation, the plain girl, the human currency. For a fraction of a second, I felt he saw me, the woman standing before him, humiliated, but not broken. It was a look that disrupted everything, a crack in the smooth, cold surface of his indifference. He saw the flicker of pride in my eyes, the set of my jaw, and he did not look away. A long silence stretched, pulled taut between us. Mrs. Gable looked on, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. The Duke's gaze remained on my face, and I felt a strange and unfamiliar warmth spread through my chest, a sensation so foreign I could not name it. "That will not be necessary," he said at last, his voice losing some of its hard edge. "The journey is long. You will stay. Mrs. Gable, see Miss Vance to the east wing." He turned without another word and disappeared back into the shadows from which he had come, leaving me with the echo of his voice and the lingering imprint of that disruptive, unsettling gaze. I had been sent to a monster, but the man I had just met was something far more dangerous. A man who had, for one bewildering moment, truly seen me. The East Wing was as remote and forgotten as I felt. My rooms were spacious but cold, furnished with heavy, dust-sheeted mahogany and threadbare tapestries depicting grim, faded hunts. A single window looked out over the wild, windswept moor, a landscape of beautiful desolation that mirrored my own heart. I spent the first few days in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the summons that would send me home in disgrace. I took my meals on a tray in my room, delivered by a silent maid who would not meet my eyes. The Duke remained unseen,
a ghostly presence in his own home.
I was a prisoner of his inexplicable decision to let me stay, adrift in a sea of silence and stone. My only solace was the manor's library. I discovered it on the third day, a vast, two-storied chamber filled with the comforting scent of old paper and leather. It was the heart of the house, and it seemed to be the only room that held any warmth. Sunlight, thin and pale though it was, streamed through the tall windows, illuminating swirling dust motes in long, slanted ribbons of light. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, a treasure trove that made my breath catch in my throat. I ran my fingers along the spines, a litany of beloved authors, of poets and philosophers and historians. It felt like coming home. It was there that he found me again. I was perched on a ladder, reaching for a worn volume of Seneca, when I heard the soft click of the door. I turned, startled, to see him standing there, watching me. He was dressed less formally than before, in a dark coat and riding breeches, and for a moment he looked less like a duke and more like a man. He did not speak, simply inclined his head towards the book in my hand. "An ambitious choice for a morning's read," he commented, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. I felt my cheeks grow warm. "I find his stoicism comforting," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I expected. "Do you?" He moved further into the room, his eyes scanning the shelves. "I have always found him to be a cold comfort, a philosophy for men who wish to pretend they do not have hearts." He stopped before a shelf of poetry, his long fingers tracing the gold-leaf title of a book. "You may have the run of the library, Miss Vance. There are few enough pleasures in this house. Books should not be one of them to be denied." That was the beginning. Our encounters in the library became a strange, unspoken ritual. He would appear silently, and we would talk, at first only of books. We debated the merits of Pope versus Dryden, the political theories of Locke, the heartbreaking beauty of a line of verse. I forgot to be the quiet, invisible girl. In the sanctuary of that room, surrounded by the silent company of 1,000 authors, I had opinions. I had a voice. And he, to my unending astonishment, listened. He would lean against a towering bookcase, his arms crossed, and watch me with that same unnerving intensity I had seen on the first day, his grey eyes thoughtful and serious. I learned things about him in those conversations. I learned he had a mind as sharp as a blade, a deep and abiding love for the land his family had held for centuries, and the profound, bone-deep loneliness that he masked with a severe and distant demeanour. He spoke of crop rotation and tenant farms with a passion I had never heard in any man. He was not a monster. He was a man encased in grief, a king ruling a kingdom of sorrow. One evening, a fierce autumn storm raged outside, rattling the window panes and moaning in the chimneys. I sat by the small fire in my room, huddled in my thin dress, the book in my lap forgotten as a chill settled deep into my bones. The next morning, when I returned from an early walk, a package lay outside my door. It was wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was a shawl of the softest, deepest blue wool, the color of a twilight sky. It was thick and warm and impossibly soft. There was no note. I knew, with a certainty that made my heart ache, who had sent it. He had seen me shiver in the drafty library. He had noticed. It was a small, secret kindness, an anonymous act of care that felt more intimate than any touch. I wrapped the shawl around my shoulders, and its warmth felt like an embrace. It was the first of his kindnesses. A few days later, a stack of freshly chopped firewood appeared by my hearth. Then, a rare edition of metaphysical poetry I had mentioned wanting to read was left on the table where I usually sat in the library. These were quiet, subtle gestures, offerings laid at the shrine of our unspoken connection. They were threads, weaving a delicate tapestry between us in the vast, empty spaces of the manor. The day he asked me to call him Alistair felt like a seismic event. We were walking in the gardens, a rare moment of pale sunshine breaking through the clouds. The air was crisp and clean. He had been speaking of his late wife, a rare and painful confidence. He spoke of her beauty, her laughter, and the terrible silence she had left behind. "I have not spoken her name to another soul in 10 years, he said, his voice quiet, his gaze fixed on the distant, heather-covered hills. He turned to me then, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded emotion that made my breath catch. "I find I can speak of it to you, Eleonora." He said my name slowly, as if testing its weight on his tongue. "I would be honored if you would consent to use my given name." Alistair. Alistair. The name felt foreign and yet perfectly right. To speak it felt like a transgression, a crossing of a line so profound I could not see the other side. "Alistair," I whispered, and the sound of it hung in the air between us, a fragile, beautiful thing. In that moment, standing in the weak autumn sunlight, I understood that I was no longer merely enduring. I was, for the first time in my life, beginning to live. And I feared, with a sudden sharp pang of terror, that I was falling in love with the Duke of Blackwood, a man to whom I was nothing more than a debt my cousin could not pay. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried in on Mrs. Gable's silver tray like a death sentence. It was addressed to the Duke, but it bore my uncle's familiar florid seal. It had been placed, deliberately I was sure, atop a small pile of my own correspondence from my younger cousin Clara. As I reached for Clara's letter, my fingers brushed the heavier parchment of my uncle's. It was not sealed properly, the wax cracked and loose. A single damning phrase, written in my uncle's sprawling hand, was visible in the gap. "The girl, Eleonora, as collateral for my continued forbearance." Collateral. The word was a slap. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold dread seeping through me, chilling me more thoroughly than the drafts in the East Wing ever could. All the warmth I had collected over the past weeks, the quiet conversations, the shared smiles over a line of poetry, the impossible softness of a blue wool shawl, evaporated, leaving behind a bitter, icy residue of shame. I was not a guest. I was not a companion. I was an object held in security for a loan. With trembling fingers, I eased the letter from its envelope. I knew I should not, that it was a violation of trust, but a frantic, desperate need to know the full truth propelled me. I read the whole sordid thing, standing there in the cold morning light of the hall. It was all there, laid out in black and white. My uncle's groveling tone, his promises of my biddable nature and uncomplaining disposition. He wrote of me as one would a horse, detailing my virtues as a piece of property. Every secret kindness from Alistair, every thoughtful gesture, was instantly recontextualized. The firewood, the book, the shawl, were they not simply the acts of a man maintaining his collateral, polishing a piece of silver he now owned? The fragile hope that had begun to bloom in my heart withered and died, turning to ash in my mouth. I did not know how long I stood there, the letter clutched in my hand, the paper crinkling in my tightening fist. I felt a key turn in a lock I had not known was there, imprisoning me in a cell of utter humiliation. He had known all along. Every moment of intellectual connection, every shared glance had been predicated on this disgusting commercial lie. He was not a man seeing past my plain face to my mind. He was a creditor, examining his purchase. I found him in the library. He was standing by the window staring out at the moor, a cup of coffee untouched on a table beside him. He turned as I entered, a faint, rare smile touching his lips. The sight of it was like a knife in my gut. He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up the letter, my hand shaking so violently the paper rattled. "Collateral," I said, my voice a strangled whisper. "Is that what I am to you?" His smile vanished. The warmth in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a guarded, shuttered look. He saw the letter in my hand and a muscle in his jaw clenched. He did not feign ignorance. He did not lie. He simply looked at me, his expression a mixture of regret and something I could not decipher. "Eleonora," he began, his voice low. "Do not," I interrupted, a surge of raw, painful anger giving me strength. "Do not use my name, not when you purchased the right to it along with my uncle's debts." I took a step forward, my whole body trembling. All of it, the books, the conversations, your feigned interest. Was it all just a part of the transaction? Were you merely assessing the value of your acquisition? The words were bitter and ugly, but I could not stop them. The pain was too great, a wild, wounded thing tearing at my insides. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides, stopping so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. His face was etched with a torment that mirrored my own. "The initial arrangement was precisely as you imagine," he said, his voice raw, honest. "It was a distasteful, contemptible business proposition from a desperate man. I accepted because it was easier than foreclosing and ruining a family I cared nothing for." He reached out as if to touch my arm, then let his hand fall to his side. "But that was before you arrived." "Before you inspected the goods?" I retorted, my voice dripping with a sarcasm born of deep hurt. "No," he said, and his voice was suddenly fierce, commanding. "Before I saw you standing in my hall, looking like a lost sparrow in a tempest, and yet you met my eyes with a fire I had not seen in a decade. Before I heard you argue with me about Seneca with a passion and intelligence that stunned me into silence. Before I realized I was listening for your footsteps in the hall. Everything about the debt was a catastrophe I did not plan for, Eleonora. But you were the catastrophe I never could have imagined." His words struck me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the anger and cynicism right out of me, leaving me breathless and confused. He saw the doubt, the warring emotions in my eyes. He turned from me and walked to the heavy oak desk that dominated one corner of the room. He unlocked a drawer and pulled out a sheaf of papers, bound with a solicitor's ribbon. He held them out to me. "I sent this to your uncle a fortnight ago," he said quietly. "My solicitor delivered it himself." My hands shook as I took the documents. It was a legally executed deed, the full and complete forgiveness of my Uncle Thomas's debt, with no conditions attached. Every penny, every marker my cousin Robert had signed away was canceled. The date on the document was from 2 weeks past, long before my uncle's fawning letter had ever arrived, long before this terrible morning. He had freed me before I had even known I was caged. "Why?" I whispered, looking up at him, my eyes blurring with tears. "Because I could not in good conscience court a woman who was bound to me by anything other than her own free will," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I had never heard from him before. "I had to clear the board of all pieces before I could ask you to consider my own." He took a hesitant step closer. "I have lived in a gray world for 10 years, Eleonora, a world without color or warmth, a house of memory and dust. And then you came. You came and you filled the silence. You brought books and arguments and light." He stopped before me, his pale gray eyes burning with a desperate sincerity. "I am a man ill-versed in the language of the heart. I have kept mine locked away for a very long time. But you, with your quiet strength and your brilliant mind, you have found a key. I am asking you, not as a duke to a commoner, not as a creditor to a debt, but as a man, as Alistair, to see if you might be willing to stay. Not as collateral, but as my wife." The confession hung in the air between us, as profound and sacred as a prayer. He had taken action. He had defended my honor before I even knew it was under attack. He had made himself vulnerable, laying his shuttered heart bare for my inspection. The tears that had been blurring my vision finally fell, tracing hot paths down my cheeks. In that moment, the last of my doubts, the last of my fear, washed away on that cleansing tide. I saw not the savage Duke, but Alistair, a man who had been just as lost as I was, and who was now, impossibly, asking me to help him find his way home. I could not find the words, so I simply nodded, a slow and deep and shaking movement. A smile, a true and radiant smile, broke across his face, transforming his severe features into something breathtakingly handsome. He had unmade all my assumptions, all my fears, with the simple, irrefutable power of the truth. We were no longer two separate, lonely people in a vast and empty house. We were an alliance, forged in the quiet sanctuary of a library, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that whatever came next, we would face it together. The sound of a carriage arriving on the gravel drive a week later was a harsh, unwelcome intrusion into the fragile peace we had built. I was in the morning room with Alistair, reviewing some plans for a new glass house he wanted to build, when Mrs. Gable entered, her face set in lines of grim displeasure. "Your Grace," she announced, "Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Vance, and Mr. Robert Vance. They are in the grand drawing room." Alistair's hand covered mine, where it rested on the architectural drawings. His touch was steady, reassuring. "It seems the vultures have come to roost," he murmured, his voice low and calm. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. I straightened my shoulders and gave him a small, determined nod. I would not hide. I was no longer the girl who listened through closed doors. I was the woman who would face her accusers. We entered the drawing room together. My aunt, uncle, and cousin stood in a tight, anxious cluster near the fireplace, looking small and out of place amidst the grandeur of the room. My Aunt Augusta surged forward, her face wreathed in a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Your Grace, and Eleonora, my dear child, we were so concerned. We came as soon as we heard the debt was resolved, to ensure everything was proper." Her eyes darted around the room, assessing the wealth, her mind clearly calculating the advantages of this new association. My cousin Robert shifted his weight, unable to meet my gaze, his expression a sullen mixture of resentment and greed. Uncle Thomas simply wrung his hands, looking miserable. "Everything is quite proper, Mrs. Vance," Alistair said, his voice cool and level. He did not invite them to sit. He stood beside me, a silent, unmovable guardian. Aunt Augusta's brittle smile faltered for a second. Of course. We are here simply to discuss the formalities of the arrangement. A betrothal announcement, perhaps. It would be most beneficial for all parties to present a united front." She was attempting to seize control, to frame this as her victory, a brilliant piece of social maneuvering she had engineered. "There is no arrangement to discuss," Alistair stated, his words dropping like ice into the tense silence. He moved to his desk and picked up the very document he had shown me. "As you know, the debt has been forgiven, unconditionally. There are no further obligations on either side. Our business is concluded." My aunt's face paled. "But Eleonora," she stammered, gesturing toward me as if I were a piece of evidence. "She is here. Surely her presence implies—" This was my moment. The fear I had lived with my entire life, the fear of their disapproval, of being a burden, simply fell away. I stepped forward, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the high ceilings of the vast room. "My presence here, Aunt, has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with Robert's debts or your social ambitions." I looked directly at her, at the woman who had called me plain and useless, who had seen me only as a problem to be solved. "His Grace has asked me to be his wife, and I have accepted. I am here because I am loved. It is a concept with which I know you are only vaguely familiar." A gasp escaped my aunt's lips. Robert swore under his breath. Uncle Thomas looked as if he might faint. My aunt recovered first, her face contorting with a venomous rage. "You ungrateful wretch! After all we have done for you, taken you in, fed you, clothed you, And this is how you repay us? By aligning yourself with this man, and cutting us off from our rightful due? Your rightful due? Alistair's voice cut through her tirade like a whip. You sent your niece to a man you believed a monster, a savage, to pay for your son's fecklessness. You did not care for her safety or her happiness, only for your own skins. You have no rights here. You have no standing. You are owed nothing. He walked to the bell pull and gave it a sharp tug. Mrs. Gable will show you out. Do not presume to set foot on my property again. Their defeat was absolute. Stripped of their leverage, their schemes exposed, they had nothing left. My aunt shot me a look of pure hatred, her face a mask of thwarted greed. Robert shuffled out behind her, his shoulders slumped in failure. My uncle, true to form, said nothing at all, simply followed his wife like a chastened dog. As the great oak doors closed behind them, a profound silence descended on the room. The air felt cleaner, lighter. A chapter of my life, a long and painful one, had just ended. Alistair came to stand before me. He gently took my hands in his. They were cold, but his were warm. "Are you well?" he asked, his gray eyes searching my face with tender concern. "I am," I said, and I was surprised to find that it was true. I felt a sense of release so powerful it was almost dizzying. I have never spoken to her like that in my life. "You spoke the truth," he said softly, "and you did it with a courage and a grace that takes my breath away." He lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to my knuckles. "Come, let us leave this room. Their ghosts are not welcome here." He led me out of the drawing room and into the gardens, where the late afternoon sun was casting long, golden shadows across the lawns. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and roses. We walked in a comfortable silence for a time, simply breathing in the peace of the moment. He led me to a stone bench overlooking the moors, which were now painted in shades of purple and gold by the setting sun. He turned to me, his expression serious, his hands still holding mine. "Eleanor Vance," he said formally, though his eyes were soft. "You are the strongest, wisest, most honorable woman I have ever known. You have brought my house and my heart back to life. I ask you again, freely and without obligation, will you be my wife? Will you be my partner, my friend, and my Duchess?" "Yes," I whispered, my heart so full it felt as if it might burst. "Oh, yes, Alistair, yes." He smiled, a slow, beautiful unfolding of joy, and then he leaned in and kissed me. It was not a hesitant, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of certainty and promise, a kiss that sealed the end of our loneliness and marked the beginning of our life. It was deep and sure and full of a profound, unspoken emotion that flowed between us, a current of love and relief. In his arms, with the setting sun warming my face, I was no longer collateral, no longer a pawn, no longer the overlooked girl in the corner. I was home. We were married 3 months later in the small, ancient chapel on the Blackwood estate. It was a quiet ceremony, attended only by a handful of tenants and a beaming Mrs. Gable. My cousin Clara came, her letter of acceptance filled with such genuine joy for me that it brought tears to my eyes. She stood beside me, a true friend in a world where I had thought I had none. I wore a simple cream-colored dress and carried a bouquet of white heather from the moors. Alistair, standing at the altar waiting for me, looked at me as if I were the most beautiful woman in the world, and in his eyes, I finally believed it. The manor, once a fortress of sorrow, slowly transformed. We threw open the windows and let in the light. We uncovered the furniture and filled the rooms with flowers and the sound of laughter. The library remained our sanctuary, but now it was a shared space, a place where we would sit together in the evenings, reading aloud to one another, our feet tangled together on an ottoman before a roaring fire. Alistair showed me the small, worn wooden horse his father had carved for him as a boy, a treasure he had kept hidden in his desk drawer. He placed it on the mantelpiece, a symbol of a past he was no longer afraid to embrace. He was not the savage Duke. He was my Alistair, a man of quiet passions and deep kindness, a man whose heart I now knew as well as my own. Sometimes, in a quiet moment, I would stand by the window in our room, the beautiful blue shawl he had given me wrapped around my shoulders, and look out at the wild, magnificent landscape. I would think of the girl who had arrived here, terrified and alone, a piece of currency in a rich man's game. She seemed like a stranger to me now, a character in a book I had once read. My life was no longer a story being written by others. We were writing it ourselves, Alistair and I. A story of quiet conversations and shared books, of mutual respect and a love that had grown, against all odds, in the stony soil of Blackwood Manor. It was a love that had seen me, truly and completely, and in being seen, had set me free.